This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everybody. Appreciate my colleagues coming here. This is, and all the members of the audience, and of course, Comptroller General Dodaro and other members of the GAO. This is an important hearing. There's a reason this is the third hearing that we're having in this Congress and this committee. The good work that the GAO has done is demonstrated by the fact over the last 2 years, just recommendations implemented from previous high-risk lists have generated $40 billion of savings over the last 2 years. I mean, that is a remarkable figure. Today we're going to be talking about the update to the list. There's some good news. I'm happy to report that DHS management has made solid progress, and there's some prospects of DHS coming off that list. We're looking forward to that. There's been progress made in terms of Department of Defense contract management, progress made with FDA's oversight of medical devices. Unfortunately, there's been some expanded scrutiny, tax code enforcement and fraud. I appreciate the fact that the GAO is pointing out the fact that cybersecurity is a real issue, a real threat, and that is a top priority of this committee to start taking, pass a piece of legislation or be involved in the passage of legislation that will address the first step in providing some measure of additional cybersecurity, and that'd be information sharing. So I appreciate that. I hate to report that there are some new areas added. Information technology acquisition, that's really not much of a surprise, but it's very disappointing to hear that VA Veterans Affairs Healthcare has been added to this, and this hits pretty close to home with both Senator Baldwin and myself. We have a facility in Tacoma. Over the last couple of years, we've lost 3 veterans to the system. 2 died with deaths related to potential opiate drug over prescription, and not even a month ago, a 74-year-old veteran with, I'm not a doctor, but pretty obvious stroke symptoms, sat and waited in a waiting room for 3 hours to be treated, probably had a stroke, was wheeled into an examination room, waited another 45 minutes, had a massive stroke, was finally ambulanced to a different hospital. The CT scanner was apparently not operational, so they couldn't administer anticoagulant drugs, and this gentleman died 2 days later. So it is noteworthy to understand that GAO has been making recommendations to the veterans' healthcare system for a number of years. There are more than 100 recommendations that have not been implemented, about 80% of the recommendations. So certainly what I'd like to get out of this committee, out of this hearing, and hopefully out of committee action, is coming up with some kind of method, some kind of control to make sure that these good recommendations that save the taxpayer so many dollars that could potentially save lives are actually implemented. I think that has to be a top priority of this committee. Let's utilize the guidepost of the GAO high-risk list and the other good work they do, and let's make sure these recommendations are finally implemented at the agency level. It will save money, it will save lives. So with that, I'd like to turn that over to our ranking member, Senator Carper. Thanks, Senator Carper. I think you can rest assured that this committee will be engaged, and 2 of us working together, we will. Before I call on Senator Langford, you mentioned a 10-to-1 payback for the IRS. I didn't mention in the committee, but I mentioned in the press conference, we often talk about cutting budgets, and all we're really talking about is reducing the rate of growth in spending. Unfortunately, the GAO is one of these agencies where we've actually cut spending. We've gone from $556 million in 2010 to $480 million in 2013 and $522 in 2014. And a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation in terms of payback, using your $40 billion figures, that's a 76-to-1 payback. Now, some of those may be one-time savings, but if you add the $100 billion of Medicare, Medicaid, and the other things you mentioned, that's a 268-to-1 payback. So, I'd recommend that certainly all the committee members be somewhat supportive of making sure that the GAO is fully funded, because it's a pretty effective payback. Senator Langford. Thank you, Senator Ayotte. I think you can tell by the number of questions by the depth of the concern, how much, first of all, we appreciate the fact that you're highlighting the problems in the VA. And so you can, again, rest assured, you will have support, and we will continue to be fully engaged, which is certainly what you mentioned in terms of the process, to make sure these reforms are implemented across your high-risk list. You will have full engagement by this committee on all the items, but in particular, you can rest assured that the VA system is going to be a top priority of this committee. Just real quick, I do want to follow up on IT acquisition. I've been meeting with the different agency heads within DHS, and I am pleasantly surprised by the repeated assurance that they are starting to look more at off-the-shelf solutions as opposed to, having the government specify something and have through a government contract, try and have some IT solution created specifically for the government, which is not particularly efficient. Are you finding that not only within DHS, but is that a reoccurring theme? Is that something you support? Are there any dangers to that?
Well, we've long said that commercial solutions, and even if you have to change your business process a bit, are more efficient than customized software development. So that's been something we've been sort of emphasizing over time to agencies. Dave Ponner's our expert in the IT area, and he has a good vantage point across government, so I'll ask him to elaborate on that.
Yes, Senator Johnson, if you look at commercial solutions, that actually is one area you should look at instead of building that's buy. There's a couple things in our high-risk area that endorse that. If you look at incremental development, if we go with smaller, quicker deliveries, commercial solutions will be considered more heavily. The other area is cloud computing. We need to look more at cloud solutions and have providers actually provide those services to agencies instead of always building them and go more to the cloud. So I think with commercial, both the incremental and the cloud solutions, which is emphasized in our high-risk area, will be quite helpful.
Well, thank you. Again, I really encourage that. Coming from the private sector, I never liked reinventing the wheel. So it just makes perfect sense. Before we conclude the hearing, I do also want to just touch a little bit on cybersecurity. Our first hearing was on cybersecurity. That is a top priority of this committee, is that first step. Can you just speak to the privacy that Americans are going to lose if we don't address this problem? Again, part of the reason we have not been able to pass cybersecurity legislation is because we have not been able to provide the liability protection to facilitate the needed exchange of information, within the private sector, the government, and back down. And again, there are legitimate concerns of privacy, but one of the points I tried to make in the hearing, and I think we need to underscore, and I just want to get your comment on it, if we don't take that first step, if we don't allow that information sharing, which does allow us to, share that threat signature, which can prevent attacks. It's not a panacea, it's not going to protect everything, but the more attacks we can prevent, we are protecting Americans' privacy. Can you just comment on that?
First of all, I think people need to understand that the amount of information that's collected, disseminated, and stored through the internet by most projections is expected to double and triple every 2 years going forward. So you have tremendous amount of information available now, but the storage capacities, so much more information is going to be collected and it's going to be shared and disseminated, including personally identifiable information over time. The only way to deal with this, and we've been advocating sharing partnerships with public-private sector for many years now since we've been focused on this area, and people have to understand that the best safeguard is continuous monitoring and diagnostics and preventing these events from occurring. Greg Wilshusen's our expert in this area. I'll ask him to elaborate on it, but we will do whatever we can to help people understand that information. More information is going to be available. The question is, the question is how best to protect that from getting into unauthorized hands and having people do it, and information sharing is a critical component of that protection.
I'd also quickly like to point out that every time you agree to the privacy statement of an application, you are giving up so much information that's widely disseminated in the private sector. And so people need to also understand that. Sir.
Yes, and I would just like to say, too, that the need for sharing information, particularly about actionable cyber threat information and incident information, is really critical to help better protect our critical infrastructures. A couple years ago, we did a report which identified among our public or private sector partners that they said that their expectations of the public-private partnership for protecting critical infrastructure, that 98% of them indicated that receiving actionable cyber threat information and incident information from the federal government was of a great need for that. However, only 27% of the respondents to our survey, who were the critical infrastructure owners and operators, said that they were actually receiving that type of information to a satisfactory degree from the federal partners. So it is critical that the information sharing processes be improved.
One of the things always has been, that liability protection. And, I'm not the person to say exactly what that liability protection ought to be, but I can say that the metric is going to be, if we pass something with liability protection, the success or failure is whether or not that information actually is shared. I mean, can you speak a little bit in terms of, the reluctance of private sector companies to share the information, the threats they really do feel in terms of lawsuits if they share that information, and the reluctance as a result to share it without really strong liability protection?
Well, certainly I think liability protection is one of the areas that is an inhibitor to some of the private sector companies. Our reviews have also shown is that often when private sector companies do provide information to their federal counterparts, they don't really receive anything in return. It's like giving this information and there's not really getting much in return of that. So there's somewhat of a disincentive to provide that information. In addition, it's not always clear. They want to make sure that the information that they do provide is sufficiently anonymized in order to allow it to be used by government agencies in an appropriate manner and not necessarily be shared with others.
Let me talk about that personal information. In terms of preventing further attacks, in other words, that threat signature, there's really no reason to have personal information attached to that information that's shared, correct?
I would say generally that would be the case.
But if you actually want to solve the crime, if you want to trace back where did that hacking come from, which, quite honestly, to prevent further attacks, it would be awful nice to find out who these bad actors are, who the criminals are. That is where you need some personal information potentially. How much can we limit that?
Well, part of the information that you would need would be, for example, like the IP addresses from which these attacks are originating. And so while that is or may not be considered personally identifiable information, it is a key part of trying to trace attacks and the sources of those attacks.
Okay. Oh, Senator Carper's back. Senator Baldwin, Mr. Dodaro, again, thank you and all of the associates from the GAO that have come here and provided some good information for all your good works. You can tell by the level of attendance at this hearing. You can tell by the level of engagement. Might be an overstatement, but this is this committee's favorite agency. You do so much good work, and we truly appreciate that. From my standpoint, one of the major takeaways, of course, is we are going to be supportive of making sure the recommendations of the VA get implemented as quickly as possible. But also, we're looking at what we can do to develop a process to ensure implementation of as many of your recommendations or all of your recommendations across the agency. So we want to work very closely with you on that process. I was handed an interesting little fact. I talked about how you actually were suffering budget cuts. I guess last year GAO had the fewest number of employees since World War II. Now, the federal government's kind of grown a little bit since World War II, so I think we'd like to give you some more resources and some more associates to continue your good work and expand it so we can implement your recommendations. So, again, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for all your good work. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until February 26th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record.
Mr. Chairman, I got just one quick